Hello! Today we'll look at some eBay arcade encoders for various platforms. If you're new to the arcade scene, there are a few colloquial terms for these devices. Keyboard encoders, input encoders, controller interfaces, and so on. The purpose is the same. Convert the discrete signals of joystick and button inputs into a signal the arcade board understands. This device will encode the arcade controller signals to match the platform. If you're building an arcade from a Windows PC, then this encoder will be of the USB flavor. Basically a generic HID or human interface device. If your arcade is based off a game console, there's some added complication. Many consoles use either a unique or proprietary signal encoding to match the console's controller. Yes, you could just wire to the pads of a respective gamepad, but we're looking for a more hardware-friendly solution. So a specialty encoder is the device we're going to look at. Today we'll look at three encoder varieties: USB for desktop computers, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 2 and 3 encoders. Are the cheaper eBay varieties any good? Let's find out. First, the Reyann Easyget for Windows, Raspberry Pi, Android, or anything that recognizes generic USB controllers. Connections to this encoder are straightforward. Each button input has two spade connectors, the other end connects to the encoder. American joystick connects in the same fashion, but if you're using Japanese joysticks, there's also a 5-pin connector as well. My setup is a borrowed control panel from one of my mini arcades, plus an upside-down Tupperware container for the 5 extra buttons I need to test. Please ask your roommate or significant other before drilling holes in your good Tupperware. Since we are on Windows, there's a few tools we can use to verify functionality. I'll have the links in the description. The left tool is a more GUI with different skins to verify button mapping, but it doesn't remap buttons, it just gives you the visual ID instead of the naming convention button 1 through 12. The upper right tool is more developer level, but it still provides useful information. The bottom right is the legacy Windows controller driver application. As it turns out, this tool is the most helpful for diagnosing something later. Functionality is simple. Digital joystick along with 12 unique button inputs over USB. This device is always recognized as a generic USB controller, so it's very plug-and-play friendly. That's good because documentation is a bit lackluster. Some eBay sellers will send you the user manual, others won't. Some sellers will also send enough wire harnesses for all buttons, others may only send you, say, 12 out of the 18 that's needed. It's a mixed bag. Either way, the wire leads are about 20 centimeters in length, so the encoder must be close to the control panel. Some features of this encoder are intuitive and well implemented. The turbo function, referred to as auto on the PCB, uses a dedicated momentary button, same thing for all the other action buttons. If you want to apply turbo, at the same time press the turbo button and whatever button you want to assign turbo to. It'll be turboed from this point on. If you want to remove turbo, simply hold down clear and the buttons you want to remove turbo from. Can you assign turbo to directional buttons or the D-pad? No. Can you assign turbo to all 12 action buttons? No. Turbo only works for the first 8 action buttons or buttons B0 through B7. What wasn't intuitive was the mode button. The manual describes this as Vision Helmet, which is a bad translation. However, it stumped me for a bit since I haven't played a flight simulator in like 15 years. This mode toggles between a digital joystick and an ancillary input called Point of View hat. Point of View is like an auxiliary D-pad. Its origins were for flight simulator games and allowed the player to look around the cockpit with this tiny D-pad on top of a flight stick controller. But anyway, this keyboard encoder works as advertised. There are 2 5-volt connections on the board for LED illuminated push buttons. The manual says this is to connect all LED buttons. No seller I've purchased from has ever provided the wiring harness for this. This header is the unprotected 5-volt and ground bus from the USB connector. Therefore, said wiring harness should have a resistor for every LED. Please keep that in mind if you're wiring this up for a dozen illuminated buttons and you're making your own harness. Overall, for what typically is a $10 arcade input encoder, it's pretty decent. I didn't notice any lag, and I would recommend this. The BoSega game control board is probably the more confusing encoder of this bunch. The BoSega encoder uses every possible console and brand name to market itself, but its primary purpose is for Sony consoles. The full title is Xbox 360 for Windows, PS3, PS2, PC, Android, BoSega Game Control Board. However, it only works for the PlayStation and PC machines. This encoder felt like the most risky one. Careless marketing is unfortunately a symptom of it being more of a knockoff product. I wasn't sure what I was getting. The main cable has a PlayStation 1 and 2 controller connector along with a USB connector for PS3, I presume. What's here is standard fare for layout and interfacing with buttons. It's the same as the previous encoder. Short spade connectors with wire leads for each arcade button and a separate connector for the directional buttons along with a 5-pin connector for Japanese joysticks. What is special is the all-in-one arcade controller solution for PlayStation 3 and all legacy PlayStation consoles before it. Or at least that's what I'm supposed to believe at this point. I connected the buttons to the encoder in what I thought was a sensible layout, but after verifying the inputs, this is the layout I accidentally created. The PCB isn't labeled with the PlayStation buttons. This encoder did not include any instructions, so this is the button layout experience of what you should expect, a guess and check method. Moving on. I'll start with the PlayStation 2. Here's a quick input verification with Tekken 3. Yes, it's a PlayStation 1 game on PS2. I tested a few PlayStation 2 games, including every fighting game I'm garbage at, and I had no issues. To really get a feel for lag, I tried Parappa the Rapper 2. Overall, I had no issue with the button timing. By the way, this extremely clear CRT picture is brought to you by me and my RGB modded TV. If you want to see how I RGB modded my TV, check out the link in the description. The joystick and buttons feel responsive, and this really sells the arcade feel for many titles. The PlayStation 2 has quite a bit of arcade collections and compilations, so having this encoder work so far without issue is promising. Based on my 15 minutes of testing the PlayStation 2, I'd say it works without issue. So what about a PlayStation 1? A PlayStation 1 is not listed as compatible, but it actually is. Here's a newer game, Crash Team Racing, working just fine. And here's an earlier game, Fighting Force. This game is 30% better with an arcade controller. It plays and controls just fine. Okay, so let's move on to PlayStation 3. The USB connector is needed to interface with the PlayStation 3. The PS3 recognizes it as a controller with a D-pad only. I didn't notice any latency issues with Street Fighter 4, however, this is only the second time I've played this game. The function buttons have a similar naming scheme as other generic encoders, but their purpose isn't quite as obvious. We'll get to that later. The turbo function works the same way as the previous encoder. Hold down turbo and any other button you want turbo applied to, it's now turbo time. To remove the turbo function, hold down clear and any buttons you want to remove turbo. The mode button is actually the PlayStation button. I'm glad it's present, I just wish it was labeled more accurately. So pressing this just functions as the same way as pressing the middle PlayStation button on the controller. The encoder says Xbox 360 for Windows, so is this also an Xbox 360 controller? What happens when you try this on a Xbox 360? Well, nothing. It's not an Xbox 360 controller. It doesn't work. Okay, so maybe my PC will recognize this as an Xbox 360 controller. No, it's a PS3 PC controller, which makes much more sense. Just the careless marketing is unfortunately a symptom of it being more of a knockoff product since the IC name is sanded off, and they're just trying to get your money. When plugged into my PC, it performs as expected. The mode button now flips between a D-pad and the point of view hat like the previous encoder. Just be aware you need to unplug the PS2 controller header before connecting this to your PC. Otherwise, your PC won't recognize this USB device. You can use either the built-in USB PCB connector with your own cable or the provided USB-N, and that's off the Y cable. My thoughts overall. Preliminary testing really shows this is a promising all-in-one solution for the first 3 PlayStation generations. Even PC compatibility is a nice bonus. Unfortunately, the way this device is marketed really does it a disservice. It's misleading, and without knowing what you're getting, I would understand if people avoid this. Because at face value, I wasn't sure what I was getting. Some listings say this has both digital and analog modes, but I call malarkey on that. I didn't see anything or have that function come up. But with all that said, from what I've tested, I like it. This unit cost me just under $18 shipped. Building an arcade from a PlayStation 1, 2, or 3 is on my radar. This device fits the bill, so it gets a pass. Finally, we have the unmarked, unbranded, epoxy glob chip Xbox 360 arcade encoder. The higher price of the three, this encoder was marked for the Xbox 360, and with its ambiguity, seemed like it falls short of the few promises it advertised. Wiring up this encoder is similar, but these wire leads are no longer 2-pole JSTNs, but a basic 2-pin female header. Wiring is still straightforward until you connect the joystick. The only option here is the 5-pin connector, which works fine except the pinout assumes your joystick is rotated 90 degrees. Yeah, this is not the standard, not that there officially is, but it goes against convention. Most fight sticks and arcade control panels expect the installed joystick orientation like this, with the connector end facing inward. This was the case for the previous two encoders I tested. But in that orientation, this encoder swaps the joystick directional inputs. The pinout is backwards. Up-down is now left-right, and vice versa. To fix this, you can either rotate the joystick or swap the pins in the cable. I swap the pins, and this is a real brain teaser when you constantly switch perspectives of looking at the joystick from the top and the underside and figuring out what is left and right because you're looking at a mirror image. On the plus side, the PCB does have all the buttons labeled, so I was able to make a somewhat intuitive layout with intent. The USB end is included and matches the OEM Xbox controller end, including this raised bump indicating the orientation of the USB plug's conductors. Also present on this PCB are the Xbox controller LEDs that indicate player 1 through 4 assignments. This is a very nice feature, except this header's pitch is different from all the others present on the PCB. It's not 0.1 inches like the rest of the PCB, and it's annoying. The arcade I plan to build will use a newer, slim Xbox 360, the one with the touch-sensitive faceplates. This Xbox has taken a few falls to said face, rendering these touch sensors useless. A very nice feature of this encoder is the Xbox button is mapped and it works properly. I have the ability to turn the console on and off, as well as ejecting the disc all from the controller input. The standard library of games feels good with this encoder. I don't perceive any lag, but this is by no means a fully exhaustive lag test. I do prefer the turbo button implementation on this encoder versus others. A single button assigns and disables turbo. Both actions are done by pressing turbo and whatever button you want to turbo simultaneously. A new feature on this encoder is a turbo LED indicator. An LED is illuminated when turbo is on and blinks when turbo is being used. What I don't understand is the need for a JST header to break out these connections. Why not use the same 2-pole headers like the rest of the button inputs? The turbo button and turbo LED both need a ground connection in order to work, and there's only one ground connection in this 5-pin connector. This is another mild inconvenience when wiring the control panel. All the inputs work as expected. L3 and R3 connections are present. However, my unit was shipped with only enough wire leads to connect everything except the R3 and L3 buttons. It's not a deal breaker, just again, inconvenient. The left and right triggers are digital only, not analog, but that's expected for an arcade encoder. What did catch my eye was the header for analog joysticks. There are breakouts for the left side stick, up, down, right, left, and the right side stick, up, down, left, right, as analog inputs. I had to solder headers to the board to access these inputs. However, it does not work as advertised. Well, it's not advertised as a feature at all, and I checked a few eBay sellers. This feature is just not mentioned, and I wonder why. Well, the analog breakout pins give feedback for both sticks, but the X and Y axes trigger at the same time, meaning only analog diagonals are activated. Okay? This could be usable for, say, games that only play on a single axis, like Brick Breaker. However, 3D games that need independent X and Y control, well, it's not usable. I suppose you could still make an analog steering wheel for racing sims as long as the up-down axis is ignored. However, this behavior is disappointing. I thought it was me, but I tested and poked just to make sure my setup was correct. After 40 minutes of testing, I concluded either I don't know what I'm doing or the PCB layout is incorrect, hence why this feature is unlisted. It may also explain why this header is not populated. Despite these shortcomings, everything works as expected when connected to a PC. Windows recognizes this as an Xbox 360 gamepad. The analog issue is still present, and I tested an Xbox 360 controller as a control, and both analog sticks function normally on an original controller. My thoughts overall are mixed. This is the more expensive encoder, around $29 shipped, which could be just the result of recouping cost spent trying to reverse engineer Microsoft's proprietary device encoding, or something else. Maybe like a higher price makes it appear to be a legitimate product compared to the alternative, which are, by the way, in the $90 price range. Like if this was too cheap, you just wouldn't trust it and wouldn't buy it at all. It's hard to say. Either way, at face value, it delivers as a serviceable digital input only encoder. It does have some shortcomings like the unconventional joystick pin mapping, a mix between header pitches, and a lack of redundant ground in the auxiliary button headers. Not to mention the goofy analog controls, but that's not even an advertised feature, so I'll ignore it. The more I reflect on this, the more this PCB feels like it was rushed to production with some mistakes and oversights. I would not say this disqualifies it from being useful, but at 1/3 the cost of trusted solutions, it does indeed feel like the discount version of something better. For simple arcade builds, this unit could be serviceable. Well, overall, this was a fun experiment. I think these encoders would serve most arcade builds for their respective platforms, especially PC, the generic USB HID device by the Reyann Easyget. I feel that one delivers on all promises, and for $10, just getting the wiring harnesses are a huge convenience, and I think worth at least half that. Don't think of this as like a full review for everyone. There's lag tests that really need to be done, because if this is a fighting cabinet and that's all you're concerned about, a greater amount of exploration and depth for lag is needed for that case. Think of this for a consumer perspective. When you're looking to build an arcade cabinet and you're trying to save a couple dollars on all the hardware that's required. If you're looking to save that money, you can definitely be deceived on some of the stuff on eBay, because it will promise everything and deliver on just a little bit of that. So just keep that in mind. So again, if this is your first arcade build, I would probably avoid all of these. Pursue a trusted solution from the arcade vendor websites. If this is not your first arcade build and you have spare parts, spare wiring harnesses, and the ability to adapt to surprises from, hardware that doesn't quite fulfill all its promises, I would definitely try these out. Just take them with a grain of salt, because I have not tested these over hours and hours of gameplay. I just tried to feel them out and see if they work. Well, that's it, everyone. I appreciate your time, and as always, thank you for watching.